It's the 11th of 2022. I'm Dana at Durnford, somewhere. I'm also known as the nuclearproctologist.org and Gamma Goat, and you can call in at 709-589-4406. Just as we were about to go live, my system froze up. How unusual is that? That happened 5 or 6 months ago to us too, when we were doing a controversial subject, I noticed. Tonight we're talking about the Candu reactors, but we're also talking about tritium, man-made anthropogenic tritium. So it doesn't matter which reactor it comes from, or a nuclear weapon or anything else, right? A reprocessing facility, etc., etc. And Canada is prolific, is the biggest producer of tritium on the planet. It's around 4 kilograms, they estimate, each year is produced naturally. This is different, though, than man-made. It's called man-made because it's anthropogenic, it's man-made. There is no regulatory agency. That's established now for sure, right? The IAEA is the military-industrial complex's little pet lapdogs, the ICPP, the UNSCLEAR, ERPA. These are all United Nations organizations. They don't have sovereignty over Canada. Why don't we just let everybody tell us what to do and forget about Canada as a country? Or America as a country, or whatever. Because the United Nations calls the shots for 195 countries. Eisenhower called them the military-industrial complex. It used to be the League of Nations. Most people. Now, in Canada, after Fukushima nuclear meltdowns, food was restricted in 14 prefectures, not just Fukushima, by 55 countries. The Canadian nuclear industry removed all restrictions in 93 days with no checks whatsoever, which was the only country on the planet with those attributes. Japan couldn't ship it anywhere else because it was banned in 14 prefectures, let alone Fukushima. And so they flooded Canada, and that's why the majority of Canadians are sick and dropping dead in the streets for the last 5, 7, 8, 9 years, is because they have filled up our refrigerators and cupboards with radioactive food from a nuclear wasteland. We're here to talk about tritium in Canada. So we got a lot of different stories to cover. Absurd amount of documentation and frightening revelations. Nuclear regulator allows Tritium Unlimited. I covered this probably a month ago. I'm just going to cover the headline. We'll get to it later. Tritium Light Factory that makes lights, glow-in-the-dark lights. Located in the airport in Ontario, released 147 trillion becquerels in about 5 minutes. The plume from Fukushima had about the same thing, and that's what it looked like. So imagine how bad Lake Ontario and the surrounding lakes were after getting pounded by that. Natural occurring tritium is extremely rare on Earth. Man-made is everywhere now, particularly in Canada. And there's all kinds of ways. Any way that plutonium, cesium, iodine can get into your body, so can tritium. And tritium becomes organically bound to food and everything else from farmers' fields. It's very, very dangerous now. These are missile silos throughout Nebraska, Wyoming, Colorado. They used to change the tritium in them every 12 years, right? So tritium production is, a lot of it's for nuclear weapons. And the fusion fable needs tritium deuterium, right? Evidence linking nuclear plants to ill health are compellingly clear something is going on. And so nuclear power plants don't just release tritium, and Canada is prolific, as you'll see. But the fuel pools with the reactor cores, and Canada has 5.5 million assemblies from reactor cores gone through a chain reaction. They're hemorrhaging, they're still splitting the atoms. So Canada uses pure 238, which means you got a silly amount of plutonium-238 and 239 into your environment, and americium of the same daughters, for instance. And certainly uranium-235 is being hemorrhaging out of the fuel pools in Canada, particularly Ontario, where the majority of the fuel pools are too. These are catastrophic releases. And so a typical fuel pool boils off about 120,000 liters a day. Tritium is, all the water is going to be tritiated, radioactive, but it's going to be full of radioactive materials. In 1979, tritium groundwater concentrations reached 2.15 million becquerels a liter. After 666, nice number, terabecquerels were released at Pickering. If you're going to release that much, you're releasing uranium and plutonium and all the other fission products too. There wasn't just a surge of tritium come out of the normal venue that it comes out, right? So that's a catastrophic event. They raised the water limits to some 40,000 becquerels per liter for drinking water. They kept that there for several decades. That's an absurd amount when you consider Colorado had a standard of 18.5 and California had a standard of 15 becquerels per liter, respectively. So Canada's reactors are basically suicide machines for the population. Tritium, in the form most commonly encountered as environmental pollutant, may actually be as effective as damaging high LET radiation and reducing the fertilities of certain species. Well, if it does to any, it's going to do it to them all. We'll get to a lot of that. So just inhaling one hot particle can cause a cancer, but there's 1,800 illnesses and diseases and autoimmune deficiencies, injuries and illnesses will manifest typically before cancer. Cancer is usually latent. So heart problems, liver, lung, respiratory, pituitary, thyroid, adrenaline, Alzheimer's, dementia, autism, diabetes, Down syndrome. That's what you should be checking for. Schizophrenia throughout Ontario, particularly, like Bruce Power and Pickering and places like that, instead of just cancer. Because that's the game they're going to play with you. Just look for cancer. Nothing else exists. In comparison with other nuclides, large amounts of tritium are released from heavy water reactors, nuclear fuel reprocessing plants, and amazingly, pharmaceutical plants. Pharmaceutical plants. You know, the one where no two radiation therapies are the same, like terracotta soldiers? Canada reactors also discharge relatively high amounts of carbon-14. And carbon-14 and tritium have similar properties. So they're assimilated into, because it's in the form of moisture and water, then it's highly pathogenic when it gets into your body. So it sequesters in your muscles, your organs, your bones. It starts pulsing energy almost at the speed of light every second. Your body attacks it for the rest of your life with white blood cells, displacing your red blood cells, carrying oxygen and nutrition throughout your body, which compromises your immune system, leaves you more susceptible to pathogens and viruses that were normally harmless and innocuous and benign. And it both up these binds with organic molecules in plants and animals, which is the worst case scenario, by the way. It's a very important facet to that story. How low doses of radiation also causes heart diseases and strokes. Don't forget about that stuff. A major difference between them is carbon-14's half-life is 5,700 years. give or take 30, 40, 50 years, which is 460 times greater than tritium's half-life. But tritium is so prolific, it wrecks your chromosomes and your DNA in your cells, which is a guaranteed way to screw up children, for instance, right? It's very, very nasty for children. This means that carbon-14 is a potent contributor of radiation doses to the future populations 45 generations down the road. Well, actually, because it's 5,007 years, there's 10 half-lives, so it's over 50,000 years down the road. But you can't just have those two. If you got carbon-14, you're going to have plutonium and americium and uranium and neptunium and strontium and the rest of the isotopes in that sample. For sure. Like I said, the nuclear industry is so vicious they lifted all restrictions from the nuclear wasteland in Japan, 14 prefectures, after 93 days. Why 55 countries kept a ban on it for a decade before the nuclear industry got someone in positions of authority to remove those restrictions. And carbon-14 is distributed globally. Pregnant women and young, less than 4 years old, children, and their mothers should be advised not to live near tritium-emitting facilities, aka nuclear disease factories. And people who live very near, within 5 kilometers of the tritium-emitting facilities, should be advised not to consume food from their garden, beehives and orchards, and not to consume wild foods like blackberries and mushrooms growing near the facility. Look, if they're advising you not to eat food from your garden, you're not supposed to be in the garden. If you can't be in your garden, you're not supposed to be in that house. And as I say all the time, you shouldn't live within 10 miles of a plant. Not only because the majority of them got sirens within 10 miles, up to 160, but because the radioactive fallout is hemorrhaging out of the fuel pools all the time. Don't you care? Don't you understand? Don't you realize the significance of the impact on all species and humanity because of things like that? These emissions don't stay at 10 kilometers. And the amount of emissions we're talking about are catastrophic, as you'll see. Because tritium reduction facilities, you actually have tritium reduction facilities, releases large quantities of tritiums themselves, and who knows what else. Nuclear reactor operators will be requested to examine the option of long-term storage of tritiated water. It's pretty hard to imagine there's no other isotopes in that water, and there is, of course, carbon-14 for sure. But because these are using 238 uranium, pure uranium, they're going to produce a prolific amount of plutonium, which is why the British company Molex here in Canada, the sabotage of Canada, wants to reprocess the Canadian used fuel, and make mixed oxide fuel out of it, the helium fuel for their fabled small modular reactors that don't even exist. Canada doesn't even have one into the non-regulatory agencies. But they're hyping it and pumping it as some kind of renaissance when geothermal could stomp all of them into the ground right away, which is what renewables is doing. Last year, it was 291 gigawatts renewables came online versus 0.4 gigawatts of nuclear. Who's winning the battle? And the International Energy Agency said between 2020 and 2026, there'd be 4,800 gigawatts of renewables, new renewables online. That's equal to all gas, oil, coal, and nuclear plants worldwide combined. Do you really think that's going to stop that renaissance? Even running reactors will be kicked to the curb in less than 10 years. They can't compete. And we're not talking about geothermal. That's been left out of the equation. The black sheep of renewables, geothermal. Because it doesn't need storage. It's reliable 24 hours a day with no toxic waste. because we have the technology now to get deep enough to tap into it anywhere on the planet. Like the Conference of Parties 27 and 26, geothermal never got mentioned a single time at all by any country, despite the fact we're seeing by 2050 they expect geothermal to be over 50% of the energy on the entire planet. But media is very careful not to talk about it. Because tritium reduction facilities releases large amounts, and it should think about storage instead of discharging. No, this industry is all about discharging. If you try, you got to contain the fuel pools in these reactor buildings. They're hemorrhaging, still splitting the atoms into the environment. What they got done, they told so many lies for 80 years. Each generation got to tell the same lies. The current generation is not only complacent, but they feel they're entitled to murder and poison the entire population. And lo and behold, they're extremely effective at it. Radiation health effects are notoriously difficult to pick up because cancer, which is just one of the 1,800 illnesses, by the way, caused by radiation are not different from naturally occurring cancers, but there's 1,800 other illnesses. Radiation, it sequesters in your muscles, your organs, your bones, your body, attacks you for the rest of your life with white blood cells, compromises your immune system, but it also leaves you very vulnerable because you have a lack of red blood cells carrying oxygen nutrition throughout your body because it's displaced by the white blood cells. And the more you come in contact with, the more white blood cells you start producing until it's finally it's called leukemia. So claiming that cancer, which is what they're doing in this story there, is the only adverse side effect is a complete misrepresentation of the facts. It's completely misrepresented. This requires a look for small increases in cancer rates among the exposed population. You should be looking for heart problems and liver problems and lung problems and respiratory and pituitary. And, the pituitary gland is in your brain. It sequesters the hormones because you start making radioactive hormones with all the other isotopes, the gammas that will sequester in your thyroid gland. It's catastrophic, particularly for children, which is probably why the nuclear industry started importing with no restrictions 93 days after Fukushima melted down. It's difficult to pick up small increases in radiation-induced cancers among the many natural cancers. The cancer epidemic began in the 70s in the peak of nuclear testing, right? Oh, and releases from all the national laboratories in North America, for instance, all the dumping in the ocean, all the nuclear testing. Like the Soviet biggest bomb was equal to 3,800 Hiroshima bombs going off at the same time. So if Russia and Ukraine fires 1,900 Hiroshima, 15 kiloton, actually it was Nagasaki because it's plutonium. If Russia and Ukraine, through NATO, fires 1,900 each Nagasaki-type bombs, is that a nuclear war? Of course it is. And what they done to the Bikini Atoll was horrific. Still today is over 1 million square kilometers. And Castle Bravo was equal to 1,000 Hiroshimas going off at the same time worth of radiation. In fact, he evaporated islands and atomized an aerosol and ionized and radiated them and left them and released it into the environment in plumes you can't see or smell or touch. And that just inhaling one hot particle can cause a cancer, but it's not just cancer. And there's 1,800 illnesses you got to worry about. And the biggest byproduct of the radiated fuel rods, no matter if it's Candu or anywhere else, is curium isotopes. And curium isotopes need lead shielding 20 times thicker than you do for plutonium isotopes. It's so important. Nuclear regulators allow tritium unlimited. And then in a 5-minute period, there was 147 trillion becquerels of tritium released into the atmosphere in about 5 minutes, which would look like that. That model is based on venting, by the way, from Fukushima reactor number 2. Over 20 days. Up in the top corner is 20 days. And they don't include the actual inventories that were lost. Instead of being alarmed and galvanized by the enormous radioactive releases, the Canadian Nuclear Non-Safety Commission staff trivialized the event by saying that the release was far below the derived release limit of 34 million trillion becquerels per year. 34 million trillion becquerels. A limit so astronomical in size, it's literally absurd. 34 million trillion becquerels. So it's tritium unlimited. It's like if you had a referendum, that could never happen, see? And if you actually had a regulatory agency, that could never happen. But that's the flaw with the Candu reactor is their disease factors. You release so much radiation. And there's hundreds of thousands of people in Ontario making a lot of money working for these things. And they've captured the regulatory agencies, the governments, the universities, and the medias. In fact, the sudden release of 147 trillion becquerels of tritium was 30% of the maximum allowed annual releases, according to the license release limit of 500 trillion becquerels per year. There's only one reason you would give them that kind of a limit. Is because it's constantly coming out of there. And if any questions arise, you say, oh, well, it's less than the allowable limits. Well, what's the allowable limits? Well, I have to go look it up. I'll get back to you in a couple of weeks. And you never hear from again, right? But that limit is 68,000 times less than derived release limit. And the derived release limit is 34 million trillion becquerels. So if they have a major meltdown, they can hide it by claiming it's within the legal limit. There's no other reason unless that's what's actually coming out of there each year. And like with the fusion reactors, the studies are showing they can't contain tritium. It's the same thing for the unicorn small modular reactors, which are the same as a unicorn. They don't exist, and they're not going to because renewable is curb stomping them at every step of the way. Are you confused? Congratulations. That's exactly what the non-regulatory agency, posing as a regulatory agency, is seeking to accomplish. Confusion to the point of mystification. The paper written below by Henrichs 3 days before it was discovered, 2012, that the Shield Source Incorporated had been exceeding the licensed maximum permissible annual releases of tritium throughout the year 2010-2011 without the Canadian nuclear agencies ever knowing. It was revealed that the SSI actual tritium 3H, by the way, man-made, right? So 2 neutrons and a proton. Emissions had been about 5 times higher than those were officially reported, and about 3 times higher than the maximum permissible license annual releases as specified in the licensing, which is 500 trillion becquerels per year. And the actual release is approximately 1,500 trillion becquerels per year. Do you know that the effects of plutonium on the lung, a single particle can cause the tumor to start growing there? These reactors are releasing tritium from the fuel pools. It's not just the ridiculous releases coming from the flawed reactors, the Candu reactors. The fuel pools are just splitting the atoms. The same atoms it takes to boil water for 1 million homes no longer contained. It's in a pool. And each day you got another, we have a lot gathered up now of these fuel assemblies, 5.5 million. Maximum allowable license releases at 500 trillion becquerels per year. It's going to be, they're not mentioning the carbon-14 in that. And they're not mentioning all the isotopes from the fuel pools that are hemorrhaging out 24 hours a day. Report concluded SSI had been similarly understating its annual release of tritium-3H for 18 years without the nuclear regulatory agencies even noticing. So Lake Ontario, Lake Superior, all these lakes are going to be insidiously radioactive for thousands of years because of the carbon-14 too, right? And the uranium-plutonium. Tritium is formed naturally in the Earth's upper atmosphere. Well, pre-nuclear industry was around 1,000 kilograms on the entire planet. Like the La Hague in France, the refuel processing facility, with 500 security guards, and Donneray in the United Kingdom, and Sellafield reprocessing facilities in the United Kingdom. Those three tripled the natural inventory in the 60s. The nuclear weapons and nuclear testing, aka nuclear war, because it's the same bombs and the same radioactive releases. The global natural tritium production that is produced by the mechanisms every year is well known. It's around 4 kilograms. And that's highballing it, right? The total world steady natural inventory of tritium, accumulated amount of naturally produced tritium found in the environment, excluding the tritium that is human-made, the 3H, comes from nuclear explosions and nuclear reactors, was around 1,000 kilograms pre-nuclear industry. Child's risk to cancer from radiation 10 to 100 times more vulnerable than an adult. Thus, the actual releases of tritium on February 1st, 2010 may have been closer to 735 trillion becquerels rather than the 147 trillion becquerels that were reported. And if that's the case, its 1 5-minute release would have exceeded the annual license limit by 47%. They've been doing it for 18 years. Not to worry, however, it's still way below the derived emissions limit of 34 million trillion becquerels. 34 million trillion. It boggles the mind. Well, there's 37 billion atoms in a curry. Each atom can make you sick in increments over time. Not to worry, however, it's still way below the derived limits. And the Canadian Nuclear Safety Committee will never compromise safety. Canadian Nuclear Safety Committee always keeps radioactive emissions as low as reasonably achievable. That's a pun, isn't it? It's the complete opposite. It's just poison to everybody everywhere. This stuff is not limited to just Canada. SSI's absurd release limit for tritium enables the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission to cover up a serious accident. And so if you're within 16 kilometers of a nuclear facility, there's 23% higher incidences of childhood leukemia. The Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission currently sets the derived release limits for tritium from SSI at, and we done the math on this a few months ago, 3.40 E times, or 19 becquerels a year, so 19 zeros. 3.4 times 10 to the power of 4 gigabecquerels. It's 34 million trillion becquerels. It's an astronomical number. Your calculator can't show enough zeros to. This is over 200 times higher than the global natural tritium production rates, and more than 10 times the total world steady state natural inventories of tritium. Each year during the past 5 years, in theory, SSI could have emitted more than 10 times the world's current natural tritium inventory. So they're talking a couple of thousand pounds a year. And that would be being generous because, 18 reactors in Canada. And this was a flaw in these reactors. You can't contain it. And they just said, frig it. The slaves will never know. Had they done so, well, they'll know everybody's sick because it causes all kinds of illnesses and diseases. Had they done so, tritium levels in rainfall and every body of water in the world would have risen several hundredfold, reaching nearly levels exceeding those measured in the peak of nuclear weapons testing in 1963. What a disgusting industry, though. Like, this nuclear testing was a nuclear war. Instead of firing it at another country, they just blew up the bombs in their own country. The releases are the same, see? You don't have to fire a nuclear weapon in anger for it to pollute your continents and your oceans and your fresh water and your children and the species. It would have triggered a global health crisis, which started in the 70s, because it takes a while for it to manifest and get diagnosed, right? Cancer epidemic started in the 70s, just after peak nuclear. These would have been as tremendous outcry from scientists, yeah, come on, please, health professionals and civil society around the world. Like they done for Fukushima, right? Complete silence. Like they done for the nicotine industry, complete silence, right? Like all the pills they sell on TV, turns out, and get sued because tens of millions of people got sick. But they made $10 billion profit, so it was worth it. Like the academic world has been captured by the industries a long time ago. There is no independent, particularly in your universities and your medias. It's completely captured. The scenario, because they've been promoting nuclear and downplaying every facet of it for 80 years, they're the schools of mass destruction, right? The scenario, of course, is impossible. All the reactors in Canada could not provide enough tritium for SSI to release that amount. So the derived release limit is literally absurd. So it's their case they have a major nuclear meltdown. They can say, well, we had an accident, but it's within the limits. And they're not going to tell you what the limits are, which means nothing to the average unsuspecting person across the country. Very few people can comprehend the documentation because it's not provided. The university's not giving it to you. The pro-nuclear community is not going to give it to you. They're going to tell you it's harmless, like a banana and a potato chip, and walking in sunshine, and getting on an airplane, and sleeping next to somebody. Should it be illegal to raise safety levels of radiation after a nuclear power plant accident? So as soon as I posted that, I got a thumb up and a thumb down. Why would anybody say it shouldn't be illegal to raise the safety limits? Why would you say no to that? Unless you're a degenerate scumbag, right? Should it be illegal to raise the safety levels of radiation? Yes, of course it should be. They should get the death penalty. Everybody who's ever done it should be getting the death penalty for doing that. Because that's what they gave you and your friends and your families and your loved ones, was a death penalty in all the species. No responsible regulatory agency. There is no responsible regulatory agency. Nuclear doesn't have one. I can eviscerate anybody that tries to suggest that there's a nuclear functional regulatory agency. I got the information. You can call in and take the challenge. 709-589-4406. I'll put that to sleep very quick. No responsible regulatory agency. That's the problem. The fact that they raised these limits so high that if all the reactors had an event, you still allegedly wouldn't have that much tritium. when it comes to tritium, indeed, when it comes to all environment releases radionuclides, the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission is not a responsible regulatory agency. They're not. They're the industry. Their job is to promote nuclear, not to protect you. There is no agency to protect you. They're truly goblins. After all these years of covering this topic, everybody that's been around can say with no hesitation that the industry is evilness beyond any concept that people have of evil. The charge that the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission is not a responsible regulatory agency was confirmed when the Commissioner awarded SSI its current 3-year license July 2009 for the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission's retained the chosen derived release limit in Appendix C of the license, which is 34 million trillion atoms. Incorporating absurd release limits in licenses is the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission's way of covering up and trivializing radiation releases. We got Michael from Ontario.
Hello there.
Hi, Michael.
Hello there.
Hi there. Can you hear me?
Oh, yes.
Okay. You're up. You're live, by the way.
All right. So I'm going to try to take the challenge.
Yeah. What challenge is that?
To talk about in this case, the Canadian Regulatory Agency.
Yeah, I'm just tormenting you. Yeah, and no, I was expecting a pro-nuclear to call in, right? That's what that was all about.
Well,
I'm providing the evidence as we're going along. Right? You know, I'm giving you the evidence, and yeah. No, so like, if the pro-nuclear community wanted to call in and say, "Well, Dana, I don't agree with this," or "Dana, I don't agree with that," then I can quantify my assertions. That's all, right? I got a big show lined up to provide all the documentation you could ever want to challenge them in court and win. So it was just, it's just a pun.
I would just like to add that I've got this local media delivered to me today, and it includes this full-page ad by this man named Peter Kenter. I don't know if you've ever heard of his post-media content book.
Not off the top of my head, no. Go ahead.
Okay, and it says at the bottom that he is writing content on behalf of the Nuclear Waste Management Organization.
Well, I'm sure I'll see it tonight or tomorrow, don't, because and so he's obviously going to be the worst of the worst. If anybody that's
Yep.
Yeah, anybody that's, and so that showed up in your mail. So now they're sending it out in flyers, are they?
This was in it's called the Londoner here because I live in London. It's not the London News, but it's like
it's a smaller version. Yeah, it's a smaller version.
Smaller, and then it contains a lot of flyers that we read.
Right, and so they're not going to have another narrative. They're just going to give it a single nuclear waste management organizations, which is the industry itself that produced it.
Ridiculous.
Yeah, there's not going to be another narrative. They're not going to ask me to write a narrative.
What's funny on the back is teams bonded to each other, hospital staff while fighting leukemia. It's on the other side of their page. So whoever put that,
there's
together,
no irony in that one at all.
To
Yeah, no irony in that one at all. That's disgusting, yeah. And that's what you expected of this industry too, see, Mike? Right? It is a batshit industry, and they're heartless. That's like, if it was illegal to poison you with radiation, then they couldn't murder you in hospitals anymore, right? And they couldn't contaminate your food and your water and your air anymore. And so there is no law. Congress and Parliament in Canada, and Congress worldwide, and Parliaments worldwide, don't have the authority to make it illegal. Only the non-regulatory agencies have that ability, apparently, which doesn't make any sense. And because we have regulatory for 3,000 chemicals, but we don't have a way of protecting ourselves from the most lethal one, because man-made isotopes are 2 billion times more toxic than industrial poison. Right? And so it's absurd that we don't have any protection worldwide from that. And the reason is because they can't contain it. Like, particularly in Canada, everybody should move out of Ontario, unfortunately, because the reactors have been releasing plutonium and uranium and fission products into the environment for 60 plus years, right?
Well, I will just add to that and say that one of the two deep repositories that they're talking about is within about an hour's drive of where I live. So I might just be considering doing that if they go through with it.
You know, everything is vented too on the highways, right? So they're going to be driving it for 45.
They won't admit that in this article, in this promotional article. They won't admit that.
No, they
say, oh, it's all. It's
I know.
a multiple barrier system. We'll use layers of natural and engineered barriers to safely contain the nuclear fuel. Use nuclear fuel, and it's ridiculous.
Yeah, I'll cover that after I hang up the phone with you here. I'll actually bring up a little clip to articulate why that's not true. No, I mean...
All right, I'll hang up and I'll tune back in on the video side.
Okay, good stuff, Mike. Thank you for the call, my friend. Take care now. Yeah, bye-bye. I'll bring up a little clip and I'll explain what that's all about here for you. So, in 2014, we covered an event at the Waste Isolation Pilot Project in New Mexico known as WIP. And it was supposed to be a pilot project, not a repository. Hence it's called WIP. I got too much. So let me just do this another way. Just put in a single word instead of... So, that one's not going to play. Hang on. Because we played this just a while back, right? Hang on. Everything that goes to the WIP is vented. But it's not playing for me tonight. Hang on. 1 minute, 30 seconds. Now it's saying it won't play it for me. I don't know what that's all about. So was that before we reformatted everything, I wonder? So everything that... There was a open house in New Mexico, in Albuquerque, after the WIP event, and they were asking, was everything vented that's brought to the site, the dry cast and the nuclear waste, right? And because it was a seeded question, obviously this was the industry, and they said everything is vented. Is vented when it leaves Los Alamos and the legacy sites. And that clip is not going to play it because it's the wrong format. And we played it not that long ago, so that's kind of bizarre. Incorporating absurd releases into the license is the Canadian Nuclear Non-Safety Commission's way of covering up and trivializing the radiation releases. And this was clearly illustrated when SSI had a large accidental release that they didn't report until 2011 or 2012. That happened in 2010. On February the 1st, it's 147 terabecquerels, 147 trillion becquerels of tritium gas into the environment. At the fill machine, they've had these accidents before, by the way. This is catastrophic we're talking about. So it's kind of like using tritium to making glow-in-the-dark lights. And they do the same thing with americium-241 where they put it in a smoke detector. It's just a little speck, right? But when you've got billions of smoke detectors with a little speck into it, you don't have to bury a lot of long-lived americium-241 into repositories, see? Put it in their smoke detectors, and because it's such a small amount in the smoke detector, then it's acceptable apparently to put it in local garbage. You should send it back to the factory. And so most people have no concept what's in their smoke detector. Pulsing energy every second. And derived release limits are calculated by the licensees themselves, not by the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commissions. So there's no regulatory agency whatsoever, nothing. And during the February 2010 accident, apparently only lasted about 5 minutes, they refused to release the details. The Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission is not accountable. So the slower you spread radiation dose is more effective, produces cancers and heart diseases and liver and lung and respiratory and pituitary and thyroid and adrenaline and Alzheimer's, dementia and autism, diabetes and Down syndrome. And so these releases are so prolific that everything is so-called low-level background, but it's mixed in with a lot of uranium, plutonium, because the fuel rods and the fuel pools are still splitting the atoms. So they're disguising it as saying you only got to worry about tritium, but you actually got to worry about the carbon-14 with a 5,700-year half-life. But you also got to worry about everything that's coming out of the fuel pools, and they got 5.5 million fuel assemblies because they haven't even tried for a repository. The Nuclear Waste Management Organization was created 18 years ago, got $28 billion. And so they've gone up into a community. They bought 1,500 acres of prime farmland, surrounded by prime farmland, and they want to bury it there. They want people to keep farming because that moves the emissions out of the environment. That's why all nuclear power plants, majority of them are surrounded by farms. So really, and is it an accident that the majority of all nuclear power plants are surrounded by farms as far as you can see, or built in large cities? No. Is it an accident that the fuel pools are at the top of the buildings, above the reactor? When it melts down, you can never get to the fuel pools. The decades of reactor cores at the top of it, and so they melt down too. No matter which one melts down, it takes out the other ones because you're burning at 9,000 degree Fahrenheit temperatures. And they use tritium for a lot of other things too. Rather than put it and store it, they found a legal way to change the laws to make it legal and distribute it into your environment. A way to assure the public that radiation releases, whether routine or accidental, are of no concern. And for years, Canada's nuclear regulatory and non-regulatory agencies used derived release limits in that fashion. This is why they say they've never had an accident, because they had nothing but accidents, but it was below a catastrophic meltdown release. Exceeds those for nuclear facilities of equivalent sizes in other countries. Greatly. A new draft operating license for SSI prepared by the non-regulatory agency in Canada for the Commission's May 2nd 12 public hearing on SSI still includes a derived release limit of 34 million trillion becquerels in tritium per year, unchanged from the past licenses. Natural occurring tritium is extremely rare on Earth. Man-made anthropogenic tritium-3H, you can't escape it. They've wrecked your planet, and there's no end in sight. It's time to rein them in. It's time to hold them accountable, too. These are criminals. That's all they are. They're criminals. They call themselves scientists and academics and employees, but they're criminals. They're working for a criminal organization, and the evidence, unfortunately, is overwhelming. The head of the Tokyo area medical clinic, risk from internal exposure is 200 to 600 times greater than the risk from external exposures. But it's actually around 1 billion times worse because it's in your body pulsing energy almost at the speed of light, almost at 186,000 miles per second, almost at 300,000 kilometers per second. So it tears apart your chromosomes, your DNA, and your cells. Your body has to repair it. So it floods that area constantly with white blood cells that are being damaged by the pulse too, which leaves you short on red blood cells to carry oxygen nutrition. So you're more susceptible to have an accident or make mistakes because you have less oxygen going through your body. And the problem is it doesn't heal, it's permanent. And it's organically bound to your cells and everything else. Release of radioactive tritium from Canadian, and there's neutron. You're talking about 2 neutrons and a proton from a chain reaction. You're talking about anthropogenic man-made radiation. You're not talking about natural. You're talking about man-made. This is terrorist organizations. Tritium dangers underrated, report says. Releases of radioactive tritium from the Canadian nuclear power plants are so elevated that children under 4 and pregnant women shouldn't live within 10 kilometers of a disease factory, aka nuclear power plant. And those living within 5 kilometers shouldn't eat the food grown in their gardens, which means you shouldn't breathe the air, which means you shouldn't be in that house. If you can't eat the food in the garden from radioactive fallout, then you're not supposed to be within 100 miles of these disease factories. That's a stunning revelation. And that's warranted too. Canadian-style Candu disease factories, known as nuclear reactors, among the world's largest sources of tritium, and by proxy carbon-14, and the fuel pools are all hemorrhaging because they use pure 238, then it's much more prolific in the production of plutonium and uranium-235. That's why Molex wants to reprocess it in a mixed oxide fuel, which is illegal in Canada. And it's illegal in the United States, but they're changing the laws to accommodate them because evil has no bounds. And because there's nobody trying to hold them accountable, there's nobody trying to have the conversation outside of, there's about a handful of people, and it's not even that. We're at it 5 days a week. And because of the constant, relentless lies we cover each and every day, I ran out of patience a very long time ago. And because of the research expeditions we carried out for many years after Fukushima, I have zero tolerance in the nuclear industry. If you haven't seen that, you should check it out at my website. Health Canada, which raised the limits after Fukushima, which, by the way, we got a poll tonight. Should it be a crime to raise the limits of radiation safety after a nuclear power plant accident? So how is it an accident, releasing in your community, raising the limits, how is that going to be safe? No. The only thing it's safe for is the nuclear industry. And it's not safe for all the women and children and people and insects and birds and animals and everything else. It's only safe for the nuclear industry because they're not going to be held accountable. And raising the limit is bioaccumulation. Bioaccumulation, every single atom that sequesters in your muscles, your organs, and your bones, your body's going to attack it like it's a cut, like a paper cut. It's going to flood it with white blood cells, but instead of after 7 days healing it and then restoring your red blood cell count, it's permanent white blood cells. So eventually, because you're bioaccumulating it, because you raised the limit, you get sick up to 1,800 illnesses, which will be diagnosed long before cancer is. Typically, not always the case if there's huge releases. Cancer can show up because you make so much white blood cells, you got leukemia and different variations of it. When you hear rare cancer, that's nuclear industry for you. Health Canada standards for the level of tritium in drinking water is very lax because it's about 10 times higher than that of the Americans, 100 times higher than the EU, and scientific concerns about tritium hazards are inadequately recognized by the Canadian nuclear regulators, which are not regulators, they're the promoters. There is no regulators in Canada. I would have heard about them. The Pickering plant on the shores of Lake Ontario is just outside of Toronto with millions of people. And it's considered levels of cancer risk to substances such as radon. Well, that's not true. It's much worse than radon because it has a 120-year life. And it's much more prolific when it's coming out of there. Radon doesn't leave the ground. Tritium ends up in your food, in your water, in your washers and dryers, in your hot tubs. Radon doesn't. Experts worry that tritium, because it's similar to the hydrogen, binds readily with water and organic matter and therefore can become embedded in living tissues for which it can harm nearby cells. Yeah, it doesn't only pulse a very short distance, but at almost 186,000 miles per second. So it rips apart the chromosomes, the DNA, and your cells in every direction. It explodes in every direction. It's like a bomb going off every second. So there's not just one of these in your body becomes flooded with it. So your body's under siege, and your immune system doesn't recognize it because it doesn't have an autoimmune trigger to fix it. So it relentlessly attacks it, trying to build a tumor around it for the rest of your life. All of it. And if you're consuming and breathing and drinking and eating it, and it's coming in through your skin and rain out, which Canada has huge tritium rainouts. Canada considers drinking water containing 7,000 becquerels per litre and 7 million becquerels per hot tub to be safe. And a becquerel represents one radioactive decay a second, almost at the speed of light. An Ontario government panel in 1994 recommended the province set a drinking water limit of 100 becquerels a litre, and lower it to 20 becquerels a litre over a 5-year period. Canada was captured a long time ago by the nuclear industry. But the voice, which would likely have led to occasional shutdowns of drinking water treatment facilities after radioactive releases at power plants, wasn't adopted. California recently set a goal of having a drinking water containing 15 becquerels a litre. Canada, because you can't contain it, is 7,000 becquerels per litre. But hey, wink, wink, nobody's checking. German government study, children living near nuclear disease factories have doubled leukemia rates, high incidences of solid cancer. The reactors can't prevent the radiation from escaping. The fuel pools can't. It's the fuel pools are splitting the atoms into your environment. Don't get lost in the tritium too much. Don't forget about the fuel pools. No adverse impacts from tritium spill at the nuclear reactor, degenerate Bruce Power says. Anything coming out of a nuclear reactor, first off, you want to multiply it by 1,000, whatever their number is. Tritium is naturally occurring isotope of hydrogen. No, it's not. Well, it is, but it's not what we're talking about. It's coming from a reactor. So putting in tritium as naturally occurring is meant to disarm the population that might protect themselves nearby, see? It's murder on purpose. And murder with a purpose. That's what the industry lives for. 23% higher incidence is of childhood leukemia within 16 kilometers of a disease factory. Tritium hazard report pollution radiation risk from Canadian nuclear facilities. It is elemental from tritium. It is invisible from HT. It is invisible, odorless gas. You can't see it or smell it or hear it or taste it or feel it or pick it up. It's identical to hydrogen gas, and the water forms tritiated water, or HTO, tritium-3H. It's anthropogenic man-made. So the recent emissions of tritium oxide to the air in terabecquerels. These are all in terabecquerels. I put that on the big screen so we can all cry together. So 2001, these are in the terabecquerels, trillion becquerels. So Bruce Power A and B in 2001 was 650 trillion. Remember, there's 18 of these reactors in Ontario. 650 trillion. In 2002, 580 trillion. So this is bioaccumulation, but at a whole different level. The Pickering, the Darlington. So the totals are just absurd numbers. And we're talking trillions. Each one of these are trillions. That's why I call them disease factors. And we're not even talking about the fuel pool emissions, which are still split in the same atoms. Each reactor core continues to split the same atoms and needs to power 1 million homes. You put 2 million atoms on the head of a needle and you can't see it. How many does it take to power or boil a bottle of water or a glass of water? A hell of a lot more than that. And so when you release that into the environment, the problem is a single atom can cause you problems down the road. A huge amount of them constantly. So the numbers we're talking about is you're talking about recent discharges of tritium oxide to the water. So the top one is air, the bottom one is to the water. So in that 5-year period, you're talking an absurd pollution machine. You're talking a hideous pollution machine. Like, that's absurd numbers we're talking about. Air releases of tritium-3H in the terabecquerels. Canada's total tritium releases. So 4,000 trillion becquerels a year. And you know that's going to be underplayed. You know that's not going to be just tritium. You know it's going to be carbon-14. You know that the fuel pools are hemorrhaging plutonium because you're using 238 uranium, right? And they make it by splitting that atom. So you're going to end up with a whole lot of uranium-235 and plutonium. Unclear 2000 for year 1997. Unclear United Nations Scientific Committee. It's just no different than ERPA or the IPCC or the ICRP or IAEA. And they all back each other up, but they're all the exact same organization from the military-industrial complex known as United Nations. George Bush calls them the New World Order, right? I'll play the clip for you, I suppose. Why not? The other clip didn't work. Will this one work? We're about to find out. I do believe I gotta turn the volume down a little bit and then turn it back up.
We have before us the opportunity to forge for ourselves and for future generations a new world order. A world where the rule of law, not the law of the jungle, governs the conduct of nations. When we are successful, and we will be, we have a real chance at this new world order, an order in which a credible United Nations can use its peacekeeping role to fulfill the promise and vision of the UN's founders.
So you just called them New World Order. Eisenhower called them the military-industrial complex. We call them scumbags. It's potato. Normalized tritium releases gaseous and liquid from various reactor types, terabecquerels per gigawatt a year. Yeah, it's not a very friendly industry, is it? Tritiated water vapor emissions to the air. When a reactor is in operation, tritium is continuously formed and continuously released to the atmosphere as radioactive water vapor. And contrary to what many people assume, few tritium air emissions are via the stack or the chimney. Most are via the continuous leakage of the tritiated water vapors from the machines, the pumps, the seals, the pipes, the reactor walls, etc. That is, tritiated water vapors literally oozes out of practically every surface nook and cranny of the reactor building. It's going to be bringing out all the other isotopes with it. It's not just going to be tritium. So every part of the reactor building hemorrhages tritium into the environment, above and beyond their so-called releases, which are like, you can't be a human and allow that to happen. So what does that make of the regulatory agencies? The volume of heavy water in the degenerate Candu nuclear reactors are large, more than 3 million litres, each at Pickering, Darlington and the Bruce disease factories, aka nuclear power plants. And then releases went up each year. And tritium releases from Candu reactors after startup. These are so this is bioaccumulation, right? 72 to 82 to 84. So whatever came out in 72 would decay by a half-life, and there's 10 half-lives, in 84. And whatever came out in 73. But because, that's what I mean, but there's this bioaccumulation because there's 10 half-lives. So, holy shit, 1989, you can see each year is steady because the buildings are getting old and decrepit. The Wigner effect, it got microscopic cracks from the bombardment of the neutrons. And they're particularly nasty because you're using pure 238. A lot of countries wouldn't use it because it produces so much radiation and pollution into the environment that's catastrophic to all 8 million species, and humans, particularly children. Emissions cause high levels of tritium contamination at the Ontario Hydro Laboratories. Adjacent to the Pickering lab resulted in incorrect tritium measurements at the laboratory. So in the end, the lab had to be closed and moved further away from the reactors because their facility was poisoned by tritium from the reactors. So they couldn't get a real reading. I'll read that again. The emissions caused such high levels of tritium contamination at the Ontario Hydro Laboratories adjacent to the Pickering disease factory. This resulted in incorrect tritium measurements at the laboratory. Now, and so who really knows what was actually coming out because that was happening? Wow. 90% higher incidences of childhood leukemias around nuclear plants. Authors call for investigation. So leukemias is where you so much radiation in your body, you're producing so much white blood cells, you got no red blood cells left, which means you're saturated with isotopes because you live alongside a disease factory that are hemorrhaging radiation. That's actually the definition of disgusting. There were environmental concerns in the early 80s. Environmental Canada grew alarmed at the large and growing discharges of tritium. Their studies showed that without a facility for reducing tritium concentrations, tritium releases would increase each year of the operation. And this is what we saw, right? Each year it increased. Another problem was the high tritium 3H concentrations in the coolant, and particularly the moderators. They used deuterium, right? Before 1990, the only active way to reduce these was to release contaminated heavy water, replace it with tritium-free heavy water, release it. There's been a massive, huge tritium discharges, because that was the only solution they could come up with, was poison everybody, so they could keep their jobs and get their paychecks. That's what I mean. I've never seen such heartless people as we see in the nuclear industry. And we've seen it from every direction. We do the news cycle, 24-hour news cycle typically. And you see this incredible contempt for humanity, particularly children and the species and dogs and cats and puppies and everything else. To allow the continued operation of reactors in early 1990, they had a tritium so-called reduction facility where they were shipping the water. I'm like, if you hear me laughing, that's the gallows laugh because it's so evil. At Darlington, was started up, which extracts tritium because they need it for bombs for the Americans, see? Because it makes the bombs twice as powerful, or even worse. From tritiated heavy water, it was licensed from the French Atomic Energy Commission and stems from a disgusting Swiss design. There's something else, folks. Ontario reactor contains 10,000 tons of moderator and coolant heavy water. It takes a number of years for the large inventory to be treated. Once through at the TRF, the theoretical maximum design flow rate is 360 kilograms per hour. It's a theoretical, though. Assuming this maximum theoretical rate, 24 hours a day for 365 days, it takes 3 years to put 10,000 tons at Bruce, Pickering, and Darlington through the capture process. But you can't really capture it. You can only capture a fraction of it, right? So each treatment reduces tritium concentration by about 2/3, which is that's speculation. There's zero possibility, right? Because tritium is radioactive water per se. Other problems are the estimated 4,000 truckloads each year, 4,000 truckloads, that transport that radioactive water to and from Darlington. They can't contain it, right? So the trucks are going to hemorrhage it too. Wow. And the TRF, which is the facility they built to capture some of the tritium in the tritiated water, owns substantial high tritium emission, but it's going to be saturated with carbon-14 too, right? So how are they dealing with that? Because they don't acknowledge that. 790 terabecquerels in 2005. In fact, the TRF net contribution in reducing tritium discharges to the Ontario public is small. Its main function is to keep tritium concentrations on Ontario reactors low enough to permit their continued operation. And got 4,000 trucks on the road each year. That's not evil at all. No, not even a little bit. That's a whole different level of evil. When I was reading that, I was like, oh, God. Derived release limits are the amount of nuclides you discharge estimate to the public to result in a public dose limit of a millisievert, which is 1,000 microsieverts. But that's not how you would measure this kind of radiation. These are, when you're talking in becquerels, like so, millisieverts and microsieverts is gamma shines, X-rays, neutrons, energy, right? The atoms are physical atoms, a totally different measurement. So a microsiever basically is, depending on which isotope you're talking about, say is 150 per microsiever. Now you're talking about 1,000 microsievers. So when talking about per year not being exceeded, they can't quantify that because they don't have control over it. They don't know who's where and who's what and who's getting when, who and where and how. And children are hundreds of times more vulnerable. So using the terminology of a millisievert, which is 1,000 microsievers, is completely dishonest. It's completely, utterly disingenuous and deceptive and deceitful. To members of the most exposed group living near nuclear disease factories, this is a representative group of people thought to receive the highest doses. They are in the ranges of hundreds of thousands of terabecquerels of tritium per year, hundreds of times higher than the actual discharges. Contrary to what the Canadian non-regulatory agencies stated above, the derived release limits do not restrict the amount actually discharged. In practice, nuclear stations are operated so that they actually discharge only a few percent. But then, right, because there's no way to contain it, we got Gar calling in. Gar Woods, you're live if you want to be.
Oh, okay. How's it going?
Live and live. Go ahead, yeah?
Oh, okay. All right. I got a new oxygen tester.
Right, yeah.
Connect the air.
And you sent me some stuff.
Yeah.
And so did you get that kinks out of that?
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm not totally conclusive yet, but you get these things factory calibrated, when they're new.
Yeah, that's different. You got to do it yourself, right?
The ones I've gotten new in the past,
Well,
they always read 20.9%. I'm pretty close to sea level where I'm at, and which is what it was supposed to be. But I noticed this newer one, it's
sorry, go ahead.
yeah, it's reading 20.8. It's always been 20.9 in the past. And my other ones, I've seen them, dip down and then come back up. But the hardest thing to nail down with these people, they sell calibration kits and, gases so you can calibrate them to an absolute number. And I've had a hard time dragging it out of them of where they get, the gas content percentage for the calibration tank. So I'm going to try a few different other companies, that sell the calibration tank.
I covered that a lot over the years, over the last decade in particular. And so after Japan, because we wiped out a lot of the phytoplankton, right? Which is the basis of the oxygen chain, the carbon sequestration chain, and the food chain. And that's why you've seen a lot of the big whales are dependent upon the phytoplankton showing up emaciated because they have to eat a lot, right? And now, but we also seen the reports that oxygen levels had changed worldwide, particularly the first 5, 6, 7 years after Japan's multiple reactors and fuel pools melted down. I covered that quite a lot, and particularly with species die off. Go ahead, Gar. I just want to put that out there.
At least 50% of the planet's oxygen comes from the plankton.
Right.
In the oceans. Now, what I've noticed with newer, combustion analyzers, because they have to have oxygen content, and then you tune these things, to the stat temperature and the carbon dioxide, and then you try to eliminate all of the carbon monoxide. But I noticed with those newer instruments, they self-calibrate on the startup, but they always say 20.9%, no matter what the atmosphere is. So it could be less if it's, 20.5, it's going to say that. And then you're tuning these things. But one of the things I noticed tuning these huge boilers is that it seems to be a lot trickier to get the carbon monoxide out of the exhaust, which is kind of telling me that I don't have the proper oxygen amount. And if you take a piece of equipment like a boiler or furnace and you install it up in a high elevation area, you have to make changes to it.
Right.
For the combustion to be good. Otherwise, they soot up and then you got real messy, rotten problems.
Oh yeah, that's a horrific problem. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm not conclusive yet on this, but I'm going to nail some companies down to get, the best calibration gas I can get.
And try,
my old one, I like it. I like it better. The sensors, finally wore out in it, but I can still get the oxygen sensors, and I'm going to try and repair it. And then
sounds good.
I like comparing instruments, for accuracy.
Yeah.
And nailing every detail down. It's even the spectrometer. I've got other instruments that will actually identify, cesium-137. The Geiger counter doesn't identify anything. It tells
it's
you
just gamma.
Things are really awful.
Like my Geiger counter is looking for gamma, but you got a spectrometer, so you can calibrate it to whatever isotope you want, basically. if you got the material
Right.
to calibrate it with, and then you can isolate it.
Yeah.
Because you do americium-241 and cesium-137 regularly, right?
Yeah, those two. I just didn't want, those calibration sources are pretty hot. And, I put them in a lead thing and put them out to the farthest corner of the garage after I'm done calibrating that instrument.
Surround them with lead. Yep.
So I'll be in touch with it. It'll take a little time. I got to order parts for the other one, and then when I'm working with the combustion analyzer again, I can make some comparisons.
Okay, my friend. Sounds
Well,
good.
that's all. All right, be in touch. God bless.
Yeah, thanks for calling in, Gart. You have a good night now. Thank you. Yeah, bye-bye. Folks, remember to keep your phone pointed at your mouth so that it doesn't break up when you call in if you think about it. Look at the numbers there for Darlington. 4,600,000 terabecquerels released. That's just one of the Darlingtons. And then when you add it all up, it's just, my goodness. Well, one is air releases, and one is to the ocean, or to the fresh water that everybody uses to drink out of. So this line here is to the air, and this line down here is to the lakes. Point Lepeau, 16 million terabecquerels. So then you got to put all the other isotopes possibilities into that equation too. You can't just have tritium. It's a little disappointing, isn't it? It's madness. So one terabecquerel is a trillion becquerels. 16 million times a trillion. It's madness. It's madness that the industry is so evil that they done that. And now we're decades down the road. You got the bioaccumulation. Then they removed all restrictions on food from Japan after 93 days, while 55 countries blocked it worldwide for a decade. To call the Canadian nuclear industry and regulatory agencies evil is being polite. Criminal is the most appropriate word. And evil. Evil criminal. The derived release limits for tritium and liquid releases Point Lepeau is higher than that for the other nuclear generating stations. As the influent is discharged to the sea, there is no drinking water pathway, so they said frigate. Look, if they've done it there, then there's most likely that's what they're doing on the freshwater too. They're just not acknowledging it. And they make the numbers astronomically large for derived releases, so that if somebody does figure out that there's a high dose in the water, they can say, well, no, that was the legal limit. Despite the fact, and again, the reason they have such high limits is because of so many accidents. So we got a poll tonight. Should it be illegal to raise the safety levels of radiation after disease factories, also known as nuclear power plants, accidents? And there's only one simple answer to that, right? There's only one simple answer. Child leukemia doubles near French nuclear power plants, and leukemia is caused by your body being saturated with radiation. You're producing more white blood cells than red blood cells, trying to handle it and trying to deal with it because your immune system is compromised. See? Combined limits, liquid and vapor, terabecquerels a year, are frightening numbers. When you compare it to like Sizewell, or the Torres, or Germany, or Belgium, Canada is an absolute monster. Look at the Canadian list up there. And then look at France, Belgium, Germany, Netherlands, and the United Kingdom. Because Canada is flawed. They can't contain it, so they just pretend that it's not happening. And pretend everybody else is getting sick from fast food and everything else. But there's 1,800 illnesses and diseases. It's unbelievable. What I'm showing you tonight is just unbelievable. So 37 billion atoms per curie. And so in a trillion, that's 27 curies in a trillion. 16,400,000 times 27. Let me go back to that. So there's 27 is 432,432,432 curies. So if you use 88 curies for a gram, divide it that way, you got 4,900,000 grams, 169,000 ounces, divided by 16 to get pounds, which means you're releasing into the fresh water 10,600 pounds a year. Yeah, 10,600 pounds, not counting, there's going to be similar of carbon-14. And then the fuel pools are hemorrhaging radiation. They're still splitting the same atoms for decades, and that's why they're trying to get a repository, and that's why Molex wants to get their hands on it to make the HELOD mixed oxide fuel for the fabled unicorn small modular reactors that don't exist. So you're talking holy shit numbers. You're talking genocidal, omnicidal numbers. Let me see. Yeah, 10,500, 600 pounds a year. It's unprecedented when you look at what other countries are doing. They're not even a gram size. Well, 8 terabecquerels. Yeah, well, that's a couple of grams. Canada's like, frigate, let's poison everybody. As long as we get our pension and paycheck, who cares about the children? The central point revealed, but this flows down to right down through the provinces, right down to the St. Lawrence, and then it contaminates the ocean. You can't dilute it, you can just spread it out. And because it's so prolific for so long, and not only that, a lot of it's going into the freshwater supplies for tens of millions of people because the Americans are on the other side of those Great Lakes. And they got reactors on the lakes too, by the way. The central point revealed by the table is that the Canadian Nuclear Non-Regulatory Agency permits such much greater discharges of tritium in Canada than is permitted in Europe. Well, like, there's no comparison. Canada is just simply evil. Europe's a couple of grams. Canada's 10,600 pounds that they emit to. That's the actual release. It's not what's sweated out of the machine or through the seals or the valves or the piping, which is astronomical. Yeah, that's horrific. Canada Health has a long history adopting soft standards in radioactive pollutants compared to other pollutants, especially for tritium-3H. For example, its former 1978 guidelines formally recommended a very lax tritium limit in 1979 of 40,000 becquerels per liter because they had a major accident, right? Why Europe or California was 15 becquerels, not 40,000. So, right, allowing that to take place is a guaranteed way to make the population sick, and you must have had an accident, a severe accident, to have that kind of numbers. That was a severe accident. And so there would have been a lot of people dying of diseases because there's 1,800 diseases besides cancer. Cancer is just one. They got you compartmentalized to only think of cancer. In the U.S., the state of Colorado had a stricter standard for the disease factors of 18 becquerels a liter, which is still a lot, right? That's still a huge amount. Canada's catastrophic. Canada's just gone evil. They don't care about anything or anybody, just their beloved nuclear disease factories. California used a limit of 15 becquerels. Well, Canada and Canada, there was an investigation, right? And they recommended Canada get it down to 15 becquerels a liter. Canada's like, we'll do what we want. We're evil. We own the government. We own the universities. We own the medias. We don't listen to you. You don't tell us. We're scum. We'll be as scumbags as we want. Both are based on a 1 in a million lifetime of fatal cancer. Again, talking about cancer, but there's 1,800 other illnesses and diseases and autoimmune deficiencies and injuries and illnesses. You can't... Ontario government was recommended to drop it to 100 and then over 5 years to drop it to 20. Canada's like, we'll do whatever we want because the nuclear industry runs the country. They tell us, we don't tell them. The current Canadian federal limit for tritium corresponds to a risk of 350 excess fatal cancers per million people. Again, you can't just use cancer. But I mean, that is significant, but you can't just use cancer. Right? There's heart problems and liver problems and lung problems and respiratory. All of these can take you up before the cancer manifests. And the cancer will manifest. You get multiple different illnesses and diseases, not just cancer. And the Canadian federal drinking water objectives for chemicals are set at a level that provide a lifetime risk of 1 to 10 excess fatal cancers per million, whereas nuclear is allowed to kill 350 per million. But in order to kill 350 per million, you have to wound the rest of them permanently with all kinds of diseases. The chemicals don't have those attributes. Routine releases of tritium 3H from the disease factors known as Candu nuclear generating reactors are among the world's largest source of diseases from tritium 3H. And as explained, tritium is formed naturally in the upper atmosphere, but it's not the same as the anthropogenic man-made radionuclides. They're actually different. The resulting background tritium levels in Lake Superior, which has no nuclear facility, allegedly was 2 becquerels a liter in 1997. I find that hard to believe, actually. As a result of the discharges from the nuclear facility, tritium concentration in the Great Lakes are gradually increasing and is moving down the Great Lakes by radioactive decay, sedimentation, and flushing, which they found out doesn't actually change anything because it's constantly hemorrhaging, down the St. Lawrence Seaway. And the annual amounts added are greater than the annual amount that's removed, so you have bioaccumulation on a catastrophic level. In 1979, tritiated groundwater, tritium-3H, man-made anthropogenic groundwater concentrations reached 2.15 million becquerels per liter. Following the release of 666 terabecquerels at Pickering. 666 terabecquerels. A single release, which is why they raised the limits to 40,000 becquerels a liter in your drinking water, which is catastrophic. And 666 is appropriate because it wasn't just when you release that much, you're also releasing uranium and plutonium and americium and plutonium and all the other isotopes, right? It can't just be one. And this is why we got a poll tonight. Should it be illegal to raise the safety levels of radiation after a disease factory has an accident, also known as a nuclear power plant? Well, yeah. Where does it stop? If you don't put your foot down, when does it stop? Well, it don't. If you don't say this is wrong, there's no incentive for them to change. I'm so isolated. I can't even get 200 views on my videos the last couple of days. Look at that. That's censorship and overdrive. I've been doing this forever. People, like, all of a sudden 100 people stopped watching my videos. Yeah, right. In August 1983, a pressure tube at the disease factory known as Pickering 2 ruptured due to the neutron bombardment, also known as embrittlement, dumping an unspecified amount of coolant into the reactor building. An unspecified, really? Embrittlement is from, this is why they're only supposed to have a 30-year life at a nuclear plant, because they become embrittled from neutron bombardments. It breaks down the molecular integrity of the atoms in the cement and the steel and everything else. This is why they only use the best of the best materials for nuclear plants. Everything is inspected 3 times to try to get the 30 years out of it. And this is why they just refurbished Bruce Power and Pickering's disease factories, which it was stupid, right? They got the money. As soon as Fukushima happened, they applied for the money because they knew Canada was probably going to turn on nuclear. They also started investing the Canadian pension in the Indian uranium stocks so that the Canadian academic community couldn't expose them. Otherwise, the Canadians would have lost their pensions. Dumping an unspecified amount of coolant into the reactor building. A leak of 222 terabecquerels of tritium occurred at the Douglas Point reactor, Lake Huron, 1983. Prevailing counterclockwise circulation pattern in the lake carried the tritium plume northeast of Port Elgin, where drinking water levels reached 1,600 becquerels a liter during a 2-day period. Well, like, whenever you hear stuff like that, you have to be really suspect that lots of other types of isotopes are in that mix, most likely. In 1990, a loss of coolant accident at degenerate Bruce Power, number 4, resulted in 12,000 kilogram leak of heavy water in Lake Huron. And in 1991, following a leak at Chalk River, which melted down in 1955, by the way, nuclear laboratories into the Ottawa River, the tritium concentration in drinking water at Petawawa was about 400 becquerels a liter, 200 kilometers downstream in Ottawa, at 150 becquerels a liter, rather. And in 1991, following a leak from Chalk River, we just covered that. In August 92, a tube leak break at Pickering caused releases of 2,300 terabecquerels of tritium into Lake Ontario. So it's just the discharges and all the accidents. There's a whole lot. They should build a couple of prisons in Ontario and arrest all of them. What they've done to the entire population of Eastern Canada is just shocking. That's shocking. That's horrific. That's horrifying. And compared to all the other countries, they make all other countries look like little angels, despite that what they done was evil. A nearby drinking water plant was shut down because of radioactive. Because the sediment is so radioactive, they can't get rid of it from the water reclamation facilities. Elevated levels of tritium up to 195 becquerels a liter in Toronto's drinking water. Wow. With a couple of million people. You know they're downplaying that number, right? In 94, Ontario Hydro found a tritium groundwater concentrations of 0.7 million becquerels a liter. 700,000 becquerels a liter. Let me repeat that. 700,000 becquerels a liter following a leak at the disease factory known as Pickering. There's some naughty creatures in the Canadian nuclear industry, folks. In December 94, it's not over yet, a valve failure at Pickering 2 led to 140 tons of heavy water, highly radioactive tritium and carbon-14 water in Lake Ontario. In 95, a valve failure at the scumbags at Bruce Power caused a 25-ton leak of heavy radioactive water. And in 96, a heavy water leak at Pickering 4 released 50 gigabytes of tritium into Lake Ontario. And tritium levels in the local drinking water reached 100 times background level. My goodness. In 97, it was revealed Ontario Hydro, the predecessor to the Ontario provincial government, failed to report the tritium contamination of groundwater in the Pickering site for a period of 20 years. So anybody thinks we got a regulatory agency in Canada, it's seriously mistaken. And the many spills of large quantities of tritium are all matters of concern. This is particularly the case for the health of women, because women are the most, and children and females are the most vulnerable to radiation, by the way, as a matter of public policy. It is unfortunate that discharges of tritium are made near drinking water intake pipes for large populations in Ontario. Well, it's not an accident that they built the facilities there either. That's the terrifying part of this story. The engineers are not stupid when it comes to poisoning the population. At the least, a more precautionary approach should be adopted. Operators of tritium-emitting facilities should give further considerations to other ways and means of reducing the emissions. Really? I never thought about that. Tritium in air concentrations near nuclear stations. Raised tritium levels in drinking water are a serious matter, but raised tritium levels in the air are even more catastrophic. Because near Candu stations, tritium exposures from skin absorption, inhalation, swimming, and food ingestion, all contaminated by, and they're only acknowledged in tritium water vapors, are larger than tritium exposures from the drinking water. And the same is likely to be true for collective doses from tritium in the air and in the water. For this reason, it's important to pay particular attention to tritium in the air concentrations when you're near the disease factories. Recent emissions of tritium oxide to the air in terabecquerels. My goodness, eh? They got a hate on for humanity and all the species, that's for sure, in Canada. Well, now we know why they removed all the restrictions in 2011 after 93 days from Japan, while everybody else enforced restrictions on 14 prefectures, not just Fukushima, so that they can ship the food to Canada and poison everybody, and then eventually they can say, no, that was because you didn't get sick because of the Canadian reactors, you got sick because Japan shipped the food in. All of you. Tritium air emission from Candu reactors in the form of tritiated water vapors. The water vapors travel downwind of the reactors. The wind changes all the time. In the process of the atomic exchange, tritium rapidly enters all material containing hydrogen, including all biota, all plants, animals, and of course all people. It enters the fruits and the vegetables and the market stalls and shops, including supermarkets. Put succinctly, all biota, including humans, become tritiated to the ambient level in the environment, and that the levels of the tritium contamination depends on the tritium concentrations in water vapor emissions from old, decrepit, leaking Candu reactors. More worryingly, really, some of this absorbed tritium is fixed in the carbon molecules during the growing season in plants and in animals during cell production, cell metabolism. This is called organically bound tritium and is an important component of the tritium exposures. And unfortunately, the ICRP, the United Nations, and the Canadian Nuclear Safety Non-Commission refused to recognize these increases for repeated exposures in the dose models for tritium. Well, because they're the protectors of the industry, not the regulatory agencies. Annual averages of tritium concentration in the air measured at distances from nuclear power stations in Canada And the evidence is something. That the tritium water vapor concentration 1 or 2 kilometers from Pickering is 100 to 3,000 becquerels a liter. And Ottawa's not free of the man-made tritium, 190 kilometers away from the Chalk River disease factory. Chalk River, the Canadian Nuclear Laboratories, Chalk River, their releases are just absurd since 1955. They really got a hate on for everybody, and they're uphill, right? And they got a melter reactor where they just poured cement over it and walked away. We don't need to decommission it. Nobody's going to tell us anything. We're the nuclear industry. We'll do whatever we want, and we want to do nothing. And so it's bioaccumulation downstream from it. Particularly the children, man. How can you do it to all the children? Because that's what you're doing. All environmental materials are tritiated in their Candu reactors. That includes the water in the rivers, the streams, the drinking water in the wells. Bruce Power is an incredible disease factory. Finally, yet importantly, the data points are annual averages. Actual air concentrations will vary considerably, which is worrying as the large pulses of tritium emissions may occur, but these are obscured by the publications only of average concentrations. Right, so if they have a big release, they don't say they had a big release. They say this year we averaged, which downplays it. Well, pulse tritium concentration, because they have a number of these sign facilities in Ontario that have periodically accidents and releases that are hideous, catastrophic events for the environment because you can't perceive it, right? You can't smell it or taste it or hear it or touch it or feel it or pick it up or throw rocks at it. You don't know it, but when you get sick later, you'll find something to blame it. It was in your family. It was something you done when you were young. And you can't say it to the young people. Pulse tritium concentrations could, in theory, result in heavy labeling of cells being formed in the embryos and fetuses of pregnant women at that particular moment, on top of that. And that's true for all the species, see? Nuclear regulatory agencies allow tritium unlimited. We already covered it. So they had 147 trillion becquerels released in just 5 minutes from a light factory. So they just raised the limits. I never said nothing. And did not become public knowledge until 2012. So you weren't given a chance to protect yourself if you lived that close by. There was no models of the plumes released to the public, and I guarantee you they produced models. There's about 30% of the maximum allowable annual limits. We covered that already. Tritium hazard report, pollution and radiation risk from the Canadian nuclear facilities. The tritium in air moisture levels 1 or 2 kilometers from Pickering are reported by Health Canada at 50 to 1,500 times higher than the Canadian background level. That's frightening. And that's right by the water intakes for millions of people. That's where they put these things. It's a whole different level of evil, man. Every time we look at the nuclear, it's like, man, not only are they cowards and chicken necks, they're evil on a whole different level. You can't actually make that up. So we got a poll. Should it be illegal to raise the safety levels of radiation? This is a no-brainer, by the way. Yet we got 9% saying no. After nuclear power plant accidents, of course it should be illegal. Because if it's not, then you got to close down the facilities right away. And you got to shelter in place. In other words, the industry gets killed right away, gets snuffed out, which is what they deserve to have happen to them. Don't forget that story there, see? didn't become public knowledge until the next year. They hid it away. And there was no models released. People never had a chance to protect themselves. The tritium in the air described in previous chapters discharged continuously from the Candu nuclear Canadian reactors, folks. And as a result, the moisture in the vegetation and the food in the areas around them become tritiate to levels similar to the tritium concentrations in the moisture of the downwind in. But because of the bioaccumulation, because it lasts so long, because there's so much, and because it's so constant, the numbers are rising. And they know exactly what they're doing. And they know you're not paying attention. The resulting high tritium concentrations in areas near the Candu reactor, where there's hundreds of thousands of people living, by the way. To answer this requires us to add up the tritium that people take into their bodies from each source each year. There's 4 main sources: breathing, eating, drinking, and skin absorption. And so it works out 550 liters per year of drinking water, 490 kilograms of food, miscellaneous 70 kilograms, cereals, dairy products, meat, poultry, fish, eggs, fruit, vegetables. Annual intake of tritium for Canadians living near a nuclear reactor is madness. That's actual madness. So 73,000. That's being extremely polite, by the way. Right? That's lowballing all the real numbers. Determination of 241 americium in environmental samples. Since americium and curium behave chemically very similar manners, the alpha spectra of the 241 americium, this is what's coming out of their fuel pools in Canada and everywhere else, contain peaks of curium isotopes. And so curium decays 244, for instance, will decay to plutonium, right? The alpha peaks of 241 americium, 244 curium, 242 curium are clearly distinguishable in alpha spectrometry, so that the isotopes of 242 curium, 244 curium do not interfere with determination of 241 americium. So it's reasonable that the yield of curium is calculated from the americium tritium. So you can, once you know one of isotopes, you can extrapolate a whole bunch of other ones. Oh yeah, there's 242. Has a 162-day half-life. It decays to 238 plutonium. 238 plutonium has an 87-year half-life, so 870-year life. And 239 with a 24-year half-life. And then the studies on the dogs, the beagle puppies, all of them died within 5 years from multiple tumors in the liver, the bone, and the lung. The main point for this table is that the tritium intakes for those living near the Candu reactor is 34 times greater than background intake, where water in food is 58% the most important source for drinking water. And note that in this exercise, drinking water is from a well, which is also contaminated by tritium emissions to the air, and that tritium discharges to the lake. So the wells are contaminated from the airborne tritium, which means your home, if you open your windows in the summertime, are going to be contaminated. If you use an air conditioner, you're definitely going to be contaminated, and so is all the ventilation. Taking into account the tritium discharge from Chalk River laboratories is considerably lower than those from Large Pickering, Darlington, and Bruce Nuclear Power. You got to factor in the nuclear meltdown they had there in 1955 is still melting down. If we compare the emissions, these estimates with the annual tritium intake of adults who live very near a Candu reactor and eat the product from their gardens, the tritium intake are viciously high. You're talking about vicious numbers. 800, 850,000 becquerels a year from water and food. That's from the wells and the garden. Some kind of evil, isn't it? 1 million becquerels per year if you live near the reactors, and a third of a million becquerels per year, up to 1,400 times greater than Canadian background levels, are likely to be highly contaminated if you eat food from your garden in those environments. The numbers are just a whole different level of evil. People living close to the Canadian disease factories who eat products from their own garden are highly contaminated indeed. Scientists working repeatedly with radionuclides tend to develop rule of thumbs for dealing quickly with radioactive quantities. Although rough and ready, they're not unscientific. One of these is that the intakes of beta-gamma emitters greater than 100,000 becquerels trigger the need for some kind of action or investigation. They're more than 10 times above that benchmark. However, official agencies state that because these intakes are of tritium, not of any other nuclides, the doses are low. But official agencies are the non-regulatory agencies, right? They're the protectors of the industry. If dose factor converts each becquerel of a nuclide to a radiation dose expressed in sieverts, which is a mistake. When the becquerel that's in your body is under siege with white blood cells. That's how you got to treat it. So if you got 1 million in your body is attacking 1 million places. It's completely different. You can't put it in millisieverts or microsieverts or sieverts. 3 sieverts is a lethal dose. You die within a couple of weeks. One then compares this calculated dose to the present Canadian public dose limit of 1,000 microsieverts per year, which I got a tendency to call unisieverts whenever I see that particular sign for some reason. And that confuses the shit out of people. My apologies to everybody. So 1,000 microsieverts is a millisievert, 1,000 millisieverts is a sievert. But you can't, we're talking about physical atoms. So you can't convert that to microsieverts or anything else because it's physical atoms. And then, so that means the body has to attack each one with white blood cells. That displaces the red blood cells. The more you got, and it's going to be a lot more than 1,000. And each microsievert, think of it as 150 becquerels. 150,000 becquerels. Resulting doses are minuscule. For example, according to the official dose factors, the highest exposed person, table 8 above, only received about 20 microsieverts per year for tritium, 50 times lower than the annual absurd limit, which is not a safe limit. There is no safe limits. Your body's under siege from white blood cells is forever. Therefore, the Canadian Health Agency's radiation non-regulatory agencies considers tritium discharges, but it's based on flawed and deceitful and deceptive and dishonest perimeters, right? It's not based on actual science. An official consideration depends crucially on tritium dose factors being correct. And are they correct? No, they're not. Of course they're not. In a nutshell, the second part of this report concludes official attitudes on tritium are unscientific and incorrect. Includes the recent evidence that tritium hazards should be acknowledged by the Radiation Protection Agency in Canada that is only protecting the industry, not the population. We're almost through this. We have not considered the matter of occupational doses, mainly because of the lack of available data, but you can't just call it tritium. You can't just have the tritium. It's going to be saturated with carbon-14, and it's going to be saturated with all the other isotopes because they're all coming out of the same environment. So they're all going to flow in the same path. And that's about it. It shows that the indoor air of such homes is 70-fold elevated tritium levels compared with outdoor concentrations, that their daily tritium intake was 18 times higher than adults living in a non-occupational exposed home. So if your loved ones work at the facility, they're bringing tritium home with them, is what they're saying. Radiation health effects are notoriously difficult to pick up because cancers, and cancer is latent. There's 1,800 other illnesses and diseases caused by radiation, not different from naturally occurring cancers as much. There are many such cancer cases. Indeed, in the UK, about 25% of deaths are from cancers. UK had meltdown at Sellafield. They had Donneray, which won't be cleaned up for 315 years. The emissions from radiation, and they closed 9,400 farms in the United Kingdom after Chernobyl. They should have closed every farm in North America after Fukushima. Reminds us to look for small increases. For small increase in cancer rates among the population. Again, right, you got to look for clusters of heart problems and liver problems, clusters of lung problems, clusters of Alzheimer's and dementia and autism and diabetes and Down syndrome and schizophrenia, and just this whole host of diseases, clusters, will tell the truth, not the cancer. Cancer's latent. Unless it's leukemia, right? It is difficult to pick up small increases in radiation-induced cancers among the many natural cancers. So pregnant women and young, less than 4-year-old children with their mothers should be advised not to live near tritium-emitting facilities within 10 kilometers. So what happens? 5-year-olds are still going to get the same dose. So are 6-year-olds. So are 7-year-olds. So are teenagers. So are the elderly, who are more vulnerable because their immune systems are compromised. So in other words, don't live near these facilities if you want to live. Because if you live near the facilities, you're not living. You're going to end up getting sick. And you're going to be lethargic because your system is saturated with white blood cells instead of red blood cells carrying oxygen and nutrition. And because tritium reduction facilities themselves release large quantities of tritium, nuclear disease factory operators should be requested to examine the option of long-term storage of the radioactive water from moderator circuits and decay tanks as a way to reduce the tritium discharges. Just keep building tanks forever. And the Canadian reactors also discharge relatively high amounts of carbon-14. And tritium have similar attributes. For example, both bind with organic molecules in plants and animals. If it does it in animals, it does it in humans. So carbon-14 is a potential contributor to radiation dose to future population, but the fuel rods are hemorrhaging plutonium and americium and uranium-235 and such into the environment all day, every day. They're hemorrhaging it. They're still splitting the atoms. So when people talk about nuclear waste, they don't understand what the issue is. The issue is still splitting the atoms into the environment. So you don't want to live within 100 miles of it. Water releases the carbon-14 from nuclear disease factories, and air releases of carbon-14 from nuclear power plants, also known as disease factories. Annual tritium emissions, terabecquerels per year. It's really something, folks. We're almost through this. So whenever the type of tritium is formed naturally through cosmic ray interaction, that's not 2 protons and a neutron. Right? That's man-made. That's what we're talking about, tritium-3H. That's meant to confuse you, and it does. Well, we're almost here. Wow. 10, 11 more to go. In comparison with other radionuclides, large amounts of tritium are released from heavy water reactors, nuclear fuel reprocessing plants, and pharmaceutical plants. So there's a lot of pharmaceutical disease factors there too. The beta emitter for tritium are actually 2 to 3 times more damaging than gamma rays, for example. So therefore, to call such particles weak is misleading and deceitful and dishonest. It's better to call them low range, but not harmless. If tritium 3H dose coefficients were found to contain significant areas of uncertainties, well, I can guarantee you that's true, the health consequences could be much larger by orders of magnitudes. It's a serious risk for pregnant women and serious risk for children. And tritium in the form most commonly encountered as an environmental pollutant may actually be as effective as the most damaging high LET radiation in reducing the fertility of certain species. And by implication, such a high vulnerable stage may exist in prenatal human females. Get them when they're not even born, eh? Do you think they don't know any of this? The radiation dose of tritium delivered to specific tissues, for example, bone marrow, may be greater following the ingestion of organically bound tritium by an order of magnitudes as compared to the tritiated 3H water. And 3 more to go. All tritium models currently in use ignore the fact that organically bound, all of the models ignore the fact organically bound tritium in foodstuff may be directly assimilated into the bound compartments of body tissue without previous oxidation. So it's much more difficult for you to get any of it out your body when it's doing that. Properly accounting for the metabolism of organic bound tritium in foodstuff can increase cumulative dose estimates by a factor as much as 4 or 5 times the other factors that they're using for the free body water tritium alone. And that the major part of the tritium uptake by members of the public will occur by ingesting of food in which tritium has been incorporated in both the plant and the animal components. Well, if it's going to, again, remember, right? If it sequesters in the animals, it will sequester into you the same way, the same facets. See? Such organically bound tritium will be present in many different chemical compounds, including proteins, carbohydrates, fats, acids. So it's assimilated permanently in your body. It never goes away. And viewed a relatively large amount of 3H and 14 carbon, which may be produced from expanded fission energy, which is right, and because we got studies, we covered that a couple of years ago heavily, or from future fusion energy, and I still have all the material energy programs, it is desirable to reevaluate the potential to cause serious damage to human health. Indeed. And those major releases will look like that after 20 days. Those pulse releases that they were talking about. And anything tritium can do, the fuel pools can do better. That's such a scary thought. Unfortunately, it's not a thought, right? We've been at this so long. That's the reality. That's the fact. That's the undeniable takeaway. Woo! Made it through. Let's look at the poll one more time. Should it be illegal to raise the safety levels of radiation after nuclear power plants accidents? Yes, 100%. And look, 9% of the people voted no, that it shouldn't be illegal to poison you with even more radiation. You know why they got a limit? Because it's dangerous. You know why they raise it? So the nuclear industry doesn't get arrested and convicted. Where do you draw the line? I know where I draw the line. I drew the line a long time ago. So we're going to end the poll on 46 votes. 91% of the population took in the poll tonight said nuclear is disgusting. It should be held accountable. We'll see everybody tomorrow, Sunday night, if everything goes well. I apologize because we my system, just as I was going to go live, froze up on me, and so I decided just to refire everything. It's extraordinary for that to happen, by the way. I'm usually never early and never late. It's very, very unusual for me to be 10 minutes behind. Just about everybody else does it all the time. I believe in not wasting people's time. Show up on time all the time. Never early, never late. Show up at the same time every time. Keva wants to know, Dana, can you discuss in the future episodes the effect of the radiation on our warming climate, the atmosphere? I'll give you a quick rundown right this second. And the ice caps and warming ocean. I can so. The best way to do it is to show you a Fukushima radioactive plume model. This model is based on 16 days of fallout from Japan. So what you're going to see at the end of 16 days when the model stops is the whole planet is covered in radioactive fallout. This is a French model. And so you're talking about an invisible snowstorm of radiation. So a snowstorm, you can see it. And imagine a snowstorm covering the whole planet. So you got a snowstorm of radiation, but you can't see it from the ocean floor to the upper troposphere. And it's got serious energetic particles. They're pulsing energy every second in every direction at almost speed of light, 186,000 miles per second. Now, the gammas, the alphas, the neutrons, the betas, when they hit each other, they don't mingle. There's so much energy, they actually change direction. That creates X-rays. So, because you can't get rid of energy. You can't get rid of energy. Energy is created, but you can't destroy it. And so it's pulsing this energy, and that's accumulating. It's been going on for 80 years. But Fukushima, as you can see, was the radioactive meltdown that broke the planet's back. I remind everybody, we still got to raise money, and there's 2 links in the bottom of the description you can donate. We've been doing it for almost a decade in that way. We've never had an issue. And the link on my site, you can donate with Google Play cards or Apple cards or Xbox cards, you name it. Bank cards, you name it. It has nothing. I'll never know anything about that. It goes through a major corporation to do the donations. All I get is the final product, the donation and the name of the person who donated. I know nothing. I don't know cards. I don't know anything. I don't see anything. And we've been struggling. I'm doing everything I can, and I do 5 shows a week on top of it. And I've been at it for years and years and years. And I don't make things up. I don't misrepresent anything. I provide the documentation for my assertions almost 90-95% of the times, and the other 5% I probably will provide it when I'm saying it, or provide it that week, and I'm just sick of digging it up and showing it. But if nobody donates, guess what happens? This whole operation that we work so hard for suffers, right? And we are struggling to keep this show working and running smoothly. I'm doing the best I can, but we can't expand if we don't raise money, right? And so I apologize, because I gotta ask, because if I don't ask, nobody donates, and that's pretty tough. How are you supposed to run this operation? And I got a big operation. It's a disaster at this stage. But we'll keep rolling forward. We send out hugs for everybody. I hope everybody has a great night, great day tomorrow. Have a great weekend. We'll see everybody on Sunday night. We start our shows Sunday and end on Thursday. I used to do it 7 days a week, but I decided to give everybody 2 days off. I actually don't take any time off. I'll read the comments later. Hugs for everybody. We'll see everybody on Sunday. This was a great episode tonight. This is super important material tonight. And we crossed a lot of T's and dotted a lot of I's tonight that needed to get done. Shame on the Canadian Candu reactor community for slaughtering the population of Canada with radiation. Shame on you, folks. That's a pretty nasty thing to do. If you made it this far, don't forget to give us a thumbs up. I'm censored so heavy it might not show up. Today, in the last 24 hours, I only got 2 thumbs up on my last video. And so I'm censored. There's definitely more people watching than it shows up. And because they've never come across an honest person before, they're freaked out by it. And I'm being punished so they don't get punished. And now's the time to push. Now is not the time to slow down. We'll see everybody on Sunday. Have a great night, great weekend. Take care, folks.
Ja.